Inside a sleek experimental weapon, behind a small glass screen, sat the most unlikely guidance system ever devised. Not a gyroscope, not a primitive computer, not a tangle of vacuum tubes and wiring. A pigeon, a living, breathing bird, trained to peck at a target on the screen in front of it, its pecks steering the weapon toward its goal. It sounds like a joke, or a fever dream, or something invented for a comedy. But it was real. It was a serious, funded, scientifically rigorous program developed by one of the most brilliant psychologists of the 20th century. And the most unsettling thing about it is that, by the standards of the technology available at the time, it actually worked. This is the story of one of the strangest weapons projects of the Second World War, a genuine attempt to solve one of the hardest problems in warfare using the unlikeliest of solutions. It is a story that sits at the bizarre intersection of cutting-edge science and the natural world, where the limitations of early technology drove brilliant minds toward ideas that seem absurd to us now, but made a peculiar kind of sense at the time. And it is a window into a moment when the future of guided weapons had not yet been decided, when the path forward was unclear, and when even the wildest ideas deserved a serious look. To understand why anyone would put a pigeon inside a weapon, you first have to understand the problem they were desperately trying to solve. As the war progressed, both sides developed increasingly powerful bombs and missiles. But there was a fundamental difficulty that limited their effectiveness. And it was the problem of guidance. You could build a weapon that flew through the air and carried a destructive payload, but once it was launched or dropped, how did you make sure it actually hit its target? In the era before sophisticated electronics, a falling bomb or a flying missile was largely at the mercy of wind, momentum, and the accuracy of its initial aim. Hitting a precise target, especially a moving one like a ship, was extraordinarily difficult. This was a maddening problem. Imagine pouring enormous resources into building a powerful weapon, only to have it miss its target by a wide margin because there was no way to correct its course in flight. The dream was a guided weapon, something that could adjust its path as it traveled and home in on its target with precision. Today, we take this for granted. Modern weapons guide themselves with electronics that can lock onto a target and track it flawlessly. But in that era, this technology simply did not exist in any reliable form. The electronics were primitive, bulky, and unreliable. Scientists were grappling with how to give a weapon the ability to see its target and steer toward it, and they had very few good options. It was into this gap that one of the most original thinkers of the age stepped, a renowned psychologist whose work focused on animal behavior and learning. He had spent his career studying how animals could be trained, how their behavior could be shaped through careful conditioning, how a creature could be taught to perform precise tasks in response to specific stimuli. And he had a radical insight. The problem with guided weapons was essentially a problem of perception and response. The weapon needed something that could perceive the target and respond by steering toward it. Electronics could not yet do this well, but nature had been solving the problem of perception and response for millions of years. Why not use a living creature whose senses and reflexes already far surpassed any machine? His chosen creature was the pigeon, and the choice was far more clever than it might first appear. Now, we should be honest about the history here, because this is a genuine and well-documented project, though many of its specifics belong to a world of secret wartime research. What follows is a retelling grounded in the real existence of this program and the documented brilliance of the scientist behind it. The core of the story is entirely true. There really was a serious wartime effort to use trained pigeons to guide weapons, and it really did progress further than almost anyone would expect. The details are recounted to illuminate just how ingenious and how strange this idea truly was. Why a pigeon? Because pigeons possess remarkable qualities that made them surprisingly well-suited to the task. They have excellent eyesight, far sharper than many people. Real eyes, capable of distinguishing fine details and recognizing visual patterns. They are intelligent and highly trainable, able to learn to associate specific images with rewards. They are calm under conditions that would panic other animals, remarkably steady and unflustered. They are small, light, and require very little to sustain them. And crucially, through the psychologist's methods of behavioral conditioning, they could be trained with great reliability to peck at a specific visual target over and over, with precision and consistency. A pigeon, properly trained, was a living, self-correcting targeting device. The concept worked like this. Inside the nose of the weapon, the pigeon would be positioned in front of a screen that displayed an image of what lay ahead, projected from the front of the weapon as it flew. The pigeon was trained to recognize the target, perhaps the shape of an enemy ship, and to peck directly at it on the screen. As long as the target stayed in the center of the screen, the weapon was on course. But if the weapon began to drift off course, the target's image would move toward the edge of the screen, and the pigeon, faithfully pecking at the target, would peck off-center. This off-center pecking was mechanically linked to the weapon's controls, and it would adjust the weapon's flight path to bring the target back to the center. The pigeon, simply by doing what it had been trained to do, would continuously steer the weapon toward its target. It was, in its way, a brilliant solution. The pigeon's sharp eyes and trained responses provided exactly the kind of perception and correction loop that the available electronics could not. The bird could see the target, recognize it, and respond to its movement faster and more reliably than any machine of the era. The system even used multiple birds in some configurations, so that the weapon's guidance would not depend on a single pigeon, with the majority response determining the course. It was a genuine, working solution to a problem that was otherwise nearly unsolvable with the technology of the time. The scientists demonstrated that the trained pigeons could indeed track targets with impressive accuracy, that the concept was not a fantasy but a functional reality. And yet, despite the demonstrated effectiveness of the concept, the project faced an enormous obstacle that had nothing to do with whether it worked. The obstacle was credibility. Picture the scene when this brilliant scientist presented his idea to military officials. He was, in essence, telling serious, hard-headed military leaders that the solution to one of the great technical challenges of the war was to put pigeons inside their weapons. No matter how well it worked in demonstrations, the idea sounded absurd, even ridiculous. The officials struggled to take seriously a proposal that seemed to belong more to a cartoon than to a weapons laboratory. The sheer strangeness of the concept worked against it, regardless of its actual merits. This is one of the most fascinating and instructive aspects of the entire story. Here was an idea that demonstrably worked, that solved a real and pressing problem, and yet it could not overcome the barrier of seeming too bizarre to be real. The decision-makers could not get past the mental image of a pigeon steering a weapon. It violated their sense of what a serious military technology should look like, and so the project struggled to gain the support and resources it would have needed to move forward, not because it failed technically, but because it failed to seem believable. The very originality that made it brilliant also made it impossible for many to accept. There is a profound lesson buried in this, one that extends far beyond pigeons and weapons. Truly original ideas often face exactly this kind of resistance, when a solution is genuinely novel, when it comes from an unexpected direction and challenges conventional assumptions. People frequently reject it not because it does not work, but because it does not fit their expectations of what a real solution should look like. History is full of brilliant innovations that were initially dismissed as absurd, only to be vindicated later. The Pigeon Project reminds us that the path of innovation is not just about whether an idea works. It is also about whether people can bring themselves to believe in it, and the more original the idea, the harder that can be. Ultimately, the project was set aside, and the reason points us toward the future. While the pigeon guidance system was being developed and demonstrated, the underlying technology of electronics was advancing rapidly, driven by the immense pressures of the war. The kinds of electronic guidance systems that had seemed impossible were beginning to become feasible. And as electronic solutions improved, the rationale for using living creatures diminished. Why deal with the complications of training and housing live birds when a machine could increasingly do the job? The Pigeon Project was a brilliant solution to a temporary problem, a clever bridge across a gap that technology was, in time, going to close on its own. But it would be a mistake to dismiss the project as a mere curiosity or a failure. It was neither. It was a genuine demonstration of creative scientific thinking applied to an urgent problem, and it succeeded on its own terms, even if it was never deployed. The scientists behind it had shown that the boundary between the natural world and machine technology was more permeable than anyone had imagined. that the capabilities of living creatures could, in principle, be harnessed to solve technical problems. And the deep ideas behind the work, the principles of behavioral conditioning that made it possible, went on to have an enormous influence on science and on our understanding of learning and behavior. The pigeons may not have flown into battle, but the thinking behind them flew far indeed. Consider, too, what the project reveals about the nature of problem-solving under pressure. When faced with a hard problem and limited tools, the most creative minds do not confine themselves to the obvious approaches. They look everywhere for solutions, including in the most unexpected places. The scientist who conceived the Pigeon project was not constrained by the assumption that a guidance system had to be made of metal and wire. He looked at the problem freshly and asked what could actually solve it, and he found an answer in a creature that most people dismissed as a common nuisance. That willingness to look beyond conventional boundaries, to see potential where others saw only the ordinary, is the very heart of innovation. There is something almost poetic in the image at the center of this story. A humble pigeon, a bird so common that people scarcely notice it, sitting calmly inside an advanced weapon, guiding it with the same steady pecking it might use to find seeds on a city street. The contrast between the ordinariness of the creature and the seriousness of its intended role captures something wonderful about the strangeness of human ingenuity. We are capable of looking at a pigeon and seeing, not a pest, but a precision instrument. We are capable of bridging the gap between the natural and the mechanical in ways that defy expectation. The Pigeon project is a monument to that peculiar, boundless human creativity. By the time the war ended, the Pigeon Guidance Project had become a footnote in the vast history of the conflict, overshadowed by the dramatic weapons and decisive battles that filled the headlines. But it deserves to be remembered, both for what it was and for what it teaches. It was a serious, ingenious attempt to solve a real problem, undertaken by a brilliant mind willing to think differently. It worked in its way, even if the world was not ready to believe it. And it stands as a perfect example of how innovation often emerges from the unexpected, how the line between the absurd and the brilliant can be thinner than we think, and how the greatest obstacle to a new idea is sometimes not whether it works, but whether anyone can believe that it does. So the next time you see a pigeon on a wire or pecking at the ground in a city square, pause for a moment and remember. During the most technologically intense conflict in history, some of the finest scientific minds looked at that same humble bird and saw the future of guided weapons. They trained pigeons to steer missiles, and the pigeons, remarkably, learned to do it. It is a reminder that the world is full of unexpected possibilities, that genius often hides in plain sight, and that sometimes the most ingenious solution to an impossible problem is sitting right there in front of us, waiting for someone with the imagination to see it.